co-chair of the New Conservatives group, Miriam Cates, who joins us. Good morning to you, Miriam.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you very much for joining us. Well, we've got a Tory manifesto launched at Silverstone today. The entire cabinet's basically been told three-line whip, turn up. We're told we're going to be hearing about a further 2p cut in national insurance. We're going to be hearing about a revival of Help to Buy. £13 billion of tax cuts in total on the table. Tax breaks for landlords, you name it. Is any of this going to be enough to close that 21-point lead that Labour currently have over the Tories? Is it all about the money?
Well, the answer to that is I don't know. We shall see. We won't know until the 5th of July when the results come in. Obviously, we might see polls before then. But certainly people do want to see actual conservatism in the manifesto. And I think what we've heard so far and what has been rumoured is going to be announced today certainly fits the bill. Whether that's tax cuts, whether that's smaller things like cracking down on fly tippers, whether that's more apprenticeships, all these kind of things that actually are what our core voters do want to see. Now, obviously, we are a long way behind in the polls. Will any of this be enough to shift people's vote? We don't know. But the job of the manifesto is to set out what a prospective government would do. And so I'm looking forward to seeing it.
The trouble is with a lot of the things that Conservatives announced so far, again, we're waiting to see the full manifesto, a lot of it's been trailed, is that people keep responding with, well, OK, A, why haven't you done it? Why haven't you done it at any point in the last 14 years or the last 2 years in the case of Rishi Sunak? And B, we don't trust that you're going to do it.
They are very fair questions, and it is certainly true that the government should have been more conservative and should have done more conservative things. And you know that I have stood up many times for all sorts of issues. But if you'll allow me, let's just run through the last 14 years of Tory government. 2010, that was a coalition with the Lib Dems. There is no way that politically we could have done things like reverse the Equality Act. Not politically possible in those 5 years. 2015, Cameron offers a referendum on the EU following pressure from Nigel Farage. We vote to leave the EU. Then the next few years are taken up with Brexit. For good or ill, that consumed government. And probably rightly so. It had to. It was a massive change. 2020, we have a pandemic. We spend £400 billion that we don't have, and we shut the economy down for 2 years. Now, would you have preferred the Labour government to be in power during that period? Did we come out smelling of roses? Did we do a brilliant job? No, not necessarily. But what we do know is that Labour would have spent far more money, locked down for longer, kept our kids out of schools for longer. So no, we're not in an amazing position now because we had this pandemic and this huge upheaval of Brexit. But would Labour have done a better job? 100% no. So yes, we are behind in the polls. Yes, it's an uphill struggle. But I do think this is the right time to set out what a Conservative government would do if re-elected, clear of the pandemic, clear of Brexit. And that's what the Prime Minister's trying to do.
I think anyone who's fair-minded would accept that the Tories came in after an economic crash and had to deal with it. Again, we had the Brexit stuff, we had the lockdowns, we had all of that, and Ukraine war. And yes, an awful lot of where we are right now would have happened regardless of who had been in charge. But how long do you think this argument that we've been rubbish, but don't worry, we're not as rubbish as Labour would have been, and the same goes for the future. We'll be rubbish, but we'll not be as rubbish as Labour will be. How many voters do you think that's going to inspire?
Well, when you put it like that, it's not very inspiring. But I mean,
you're being very honest, and I appreciate that. But that's why we love having you on the show, Miriam. But at the end of the day, that is literally the Tory message, isn't it?
It's not my message, but I do think you're right. We have to be realistic. And politicians do not have a magic wand. We are ordinary people like everybody else. And if you think about your workplace or your listeners think about their workplace, how much, no matter how driven, committed, intelligent you are, how much can you change in a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, 5-year period? And politicians face those same barriers, especially when we have a pandemic, we have Brexit. And I'm not making excuses. As you know, I have opposed many of the things that the government has done over the last 5 years. But we do have to be realistic. Politics isn't black and white. This is not a battle between good people and bad people. This is about taking all sorts of things into account when you come to vote. And yes, parties can promise whatever they like. But actually, if we want to know for sure how parties behave, we can only look back. And what I know for sure is that had Labour been in power during the pandemic, they would have borrowed twice as much money. That would have made inflation twice as bad. They would have locked down our children for longer. And they would have given into every single demand for more money money, whether it's from the NHS, from the teaching unions, whoever. We know that's who the Labour Party are. Now, of course, it's not an inspiring message to say vote Tory because we're not Labour, and I'm not asking people to do that. But I'm saying when you vote, consider this. Yes, Labour may form the next government, but do you want a serious opposition of people who are going to stand up to that Labour government, or do you want a complete wipeout of anyone who is to the right of centre?
So, sounds to me you've kind of already accepted defeat then.
Well, I haven't accepted defeat, but the polls are suggesting that we are going to have a Labour government. Now, the polls might be completely wrong, and obviously I hope that. But if we do get a Labour government, as the polls indicate, the question is, how big a majority does that Labour government have? And that is a really important factor, as we've seen over the last few years.
Well, indeed, again, that said, Boris Johnson with an 80 majority, a lot of people not quite sure what he ended up doing with that. I found it extraordinary in the last 6 months. Lots of things which Rishi Sunak apparently feels terribly strongly about, but was unable to deal with. I mean, when you could wipe things through Parliament very, very quickly, when he still got a majority of 50 when he went to the polls. Can I ask you, by the way, reports today suggest that Conservative right-wingers are planning to present basically an alternative rebel manifesto if this manifesto launch fails. I mean, every time we see, a new chance to sort of, sell the Conservative Party, to sell Rishi Sunak's plan to the public, we don't see any movement in the polls. If it doesn't work yet again today, they're saying, look, here's our rebel manifesto. Are you part of that?
And I hadn't heard anything about it until I heard it on the news this morning.
Right. OK, so that's not the case. Now, one of the other things we understand is going to be talked about is about controlling Britain's borders and whether or not the Conservative Party leaves a route open for us to leave the European Court of Human Rights. Now, Rishi Sunak has mentioned this. It came up in the debate that was on ITV last week, and he sort of hints at it, but he never seems to sort of move from some rather vague language about he would put Britain's future, our ability to control our borders above membership of a foreign court. He doesn't say categorically, if they prevent us from doing this, we will leave the court, full stop. Do you think we should leave the court?
I think we should be willing to do it, but I also don't think we should think it's a simple thing to do.
Isn't it? It's a really simple thing to do. You just give notice.
It's not, Julie, because although absolutely foreign courts should not be stopping us from controlling our borders, and it's scandalous that judges can prevent an elected government with an 80-seat majority, as you say, from enacting those kind of laws. That is scandalous. But the ECHR does also provide some protections for freedom of speech and freedom of religion that unfortunately our domestic equalities and human rights framework have failed at. And if you think about the Mayor for Starter case, for example, where she won the right to say that men are not women, that was because of her ECHR rights. Had we not had the ECHR, she may not have won that case.
We could just enshrine all the rights that we need into domestic legislation.
So yes, we should leave the ECHR, but it has to be accompanied by wholesale reform of our UK domestic Human Rights and Equalities Act. That has to come as a package. We cannot just leave the ECHR. We have to do the whole thing at once. So I would like to see a commitment to doing that whole thing at once. It's a lot of work. It will take a lot of detailed legal understandanding, but it does have to happen. But that is the complicating factor. It's not quite as simple as in-out.
Just finally, we saw the European election results across the EU over on Sunday night, which, I mean, suggested, particularly among younger voters, this massive shift to the right. People talk about far-right parties. I would say, hard-right parties, but, the centre-right and hard-right doing very, very well at the expense of sort of liberal parties and green parties. Why is it that the UK, the young people in particular, seem to be going to the left, to Labour, Greens and others, rather than moving to the right? What are right-wing parties in Britain doing wrong?
That is a really, really good question. I think there are a number of answers to that. I think one of those is our voting system. First past the post just doesn't give smaller, newer parties the opportunity to break through. Obviously, we saw that with UKIP in 2015. I think they got 4 million votes and just one seat. So there just isn't the momentum behind some of these parties that give young people the opportunity to think that actually, yes, they could deliver. And it makes our two main parties very, very broad church and therefore more likely to appeal to the people people that vote, which sadly are older people. So I think there's many answers to that question, but it is hugely concerning to me that young people are not represented well in politics. And of course, we know that older people vote more and that older people are actually a greater share of the population. But what really worries me is that means that the major political parties are not offering anything for young people. And I think very much after this election, whatever happens to the Conservative Party, we need to reform ourselves as a party for all ages and all people across the country. I think that's very, very important. Okay. We cannot let the young people be disenfranchised anymore.
Well, again, I hate that they're not being disenfranchised. If they can't get off their backsides to vote, well, tough.
Is an argument, of course.
If you don't vote, if you're entitled to vote and you live in a democracy and you can't be bothered to vote, tough. I couldn't care less what you think about anything.
And we'll just go further and further down the route of a gerontocracy where all the policies are skewed towards older people. And
yeah, well, again, young people, if you don't bother to vote, that's their fault. I mean, it's just their fault.
That's an argument, but I think politicians have a duty to be appealing to young people, whether or not they then choose to use that.
Maybe
vote.
We shouldn't have that Labour policy of banning energy drinks. I'll have the energy to get to the polling station and actually cast a vote. Miriam Cates, always so good to talk to you. She's co-chair of the New Conservatives. Thanks for that.